everyone, and welcome to the Next Best Picture podcast, where I am being joined right now by the director for the film Audrey's Children, Amy Canaan Mann. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, this is a screenplay by Julia Fisher Farbin, who I understand this project has been in development now for a number of years. She had the ability to not only do obviously research on the project, but then also to even meet Dr. Audrey Evans. Were you afforded the same opportunity before her death in 2022, or did you just have
Yes.
this script?
No, yeah, I was really lucky. I was able to meet. So Julia's grandfather knew Audrey.
Hmm.
I think as Audrey did a lot of fundraising. Oop, oh, my thing just slipped. And So I think they were sort of family friends. And then so Julia knew her as a child. And then myself and the cast were able to meet Audrey, which was amazing. I got to meet her twice. I sat down with her, and she was 97 and sharp as a tack, and told me the story about having been a child with tuberculosis, and having been in a tuberculosis ward, which at the time, the 1930s, was very isolating. And that just sort of in my gut, I thought this, I think, might be the reason, her motivation for her being so tenacious in the work that she was doing in terms of understanding what it was to be a child who was ill, understanding what it was to be a child who was ill, who was also alone, feeling alone. And then, so we added that element to the story, which was amazing. And then she passed away 2 weeks before we wrapped, actually. Um,
Wow.
and, but she was able to meet the cast. She was, she knew Julia, obviously. So, yeah.
So, when you're casting then Natalie Dormer here as Audrey Evans, what characteristics did she possess that made you say she's perfect for this?
Well, I knew that we needed somebody who had a real fire to her, and it sounds counterintuitive. So it was a tricky casting thing because it needed to be somebody who you were really compelled to watch her think. And because it's essentially a biopic about a brilliant woman who's thinking. She's thinking her way through problems, and in a sort of stringent scientific manner. So somebody who had a fire to her, where you were compelled to watch her think, and at the same time could hold a real kind of aching empathy for the children, the most vulnerable in her care. Um, and then when I saw Natalie Dormer, I actually didn't, I'm not a big Game of Thrones person. But when I saw her in the remake of Picnic at Hanging Rock, there was a shot of her on her back. And I could just feel the kind of power in her shoulders. And then in the shot, she turns to the camera. And I was like, oh, there's our Audrey. And she just had that fire. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a big, massive Game of Thrones fan,
Yeah.
so but
Most
I've
people
always
are.
known,
I'm the lone wolf I have to catch up.
of course, but I've always known Natalie to be very versatile,
Yeah.
extremely talented. There's nothing that you could put in front of her that she would not be willing to do. Um, Extending to that, though, then you also have some other really great members of this cast to round things out here, namely Clancy Brown, Jimmy Simpson, both of them also with experience working across television, like Natalie as well. So, in a similar way, too, what made them the right choices here? Was it chemistry with Natalie? Was it something else?
Well, it was sort of the same kind of thinking process. Dan was a really tricky role to cast because you needed somebody who, because it's also, among many other things, it's a love story, but it's a love story about people who fall in love with each other's intellect first and
Yeah.
primarily. So, which I loved. I loved that aspect of the story a lot, because I don't think it's very often we get to tell those stories. And so you wanted somebody who, um, also had a fire, but played with it a different way where it was a little bit more solid, who could go toe to toe with her intellectually and toe to toe with her kind of dynamically. Because so you need to feel that there was equanimity between the two, that he wouldn't dominate her, or else you wouldn't kind of respect her, and she wouldn't dominate him, or you kind of wouldn't respect him. There really had to be like this twosome. And I was just a huge Jimmy Simpson fan, and he was my first choice. He was our first offer, and he said yes. So it doesn't get any better than that as a director. And then Clancy Brown, along with weirdly looking exactly like C. Everett Koop, he has
Mhm.
this kind of beautiful, generous gravitas to him, just as a person, Clancy does in the world. And that's exactly what that character needed too, because it's a bit of a troika, the three of them.
Mhm.
They are both supporting her, but also calling her out on mistakes that she's making and things that she's doing that are not helping her. I mean, she kind of a little bit gets in her own way sometimes. So there needed to be both compassion, but also they needed to hold their own as well.
Yeah. I don't mean this in any kind of a knock or anything like that, but when I watched the film, the visual style to me kind of like stood out as something that I would probably like watch on like Amazon or something like that as like a streaming film. But this is being released by Blue Harbor Entertainment. You world premiered it at the Tribeca Film Festival last year. Can you just tell me, like, the thought process between what goes into making something that would play best on streaming, or in your case too, you have a lot of television experience. You know that's going to be mostly streamed versus shooting a film that's made to be seen in theaters.
I wasn't really even thinking about that differentiation, honestly. I wasn't really because these days with an independent film, you really don't know what your output's going to be,
Yeah.
and you can't necessarily control it.
I was going to
So
say those conversations are out of your hands at a certain point,
really,
right?
they really are. And then they sort of end up, which is I think a good thing, they play on a lot of platforms. So for me, directorially, it was all about designing a visual style that would platform the story itself and meet the inherent challenges of the story, of which there were, a couple. And making sure that the world felt as authentic and accurate and visually seductive as possible, because it's a tricky subject matter. And so my notion was that if we could create, that if the department heads and I could create a whole complete world that you kind of wanted to be in and you felt was authentic and that everything was accurate about it, so you kind of could trust the world that you're in, that at the end of an hour and a half you will have been told a story about kid with cancer, but that's almost incidental to the experience of moving yourself through the film and following her, being shoulder to shoulder with her.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of your television experience as well, in the last like decade, you've had so much that you've worked on since your previous feature film that you did. Tell me a little bit about like what you picked up during all of those various shows that you worked on that you were able to carry into this.
I mean, so many. I was just telling this to somebody else the other day. I decided to go into TV by design.
Mhm.
That was definitely a choice I made. I was at the Venice Film Festival with my film Jackie and Ryan, and I happened to catch a poster that for some reason listed John Ford's credits. And I realized that I didn't recognize many of the early ones. And it just in that moment struck me. Um, it was a studio system. It was a different time. The stakes were lower. They churned out movies like we churn out TV. And so as a director, you got to make mistakes and learn from them and fall on your face. And it wasn't as opposed to independent film now and I think film in general, a little bit where you just don't have that system. So the stakes are really high. And I was like, let me just go into TV and see if
Mhm.
I can do as much different type of television as possible. I was lucky I got to pick shows I wanted to do and see if I can have restrictions to, and if I don't have all my tools in my toolbox, because every show has its own visual lexicon again, and that I can learn. I can just learn by succeeding and failing and trying this and it doesn't work and it won't sort of be a career ender. And so having done that, and then I did a Netflix pilot where I got to create a whole world again, sort of back into what you're doing in independent film, where you're creating a whole world, which was amazing. And then into Audrey's Children. So to answer your question, so much. I learned so much. I mean, the ability to pivot again, no deep pockets, no time. And really being able to work with what you are given always and seeing if that can even be to your advantage. And even if it can be when you're restricted, if that can even be to your benefit,
Mhm.
to maybe there's a better idea or a better perspective that you wouldn't have, thought of otherwise had you had all the toys.
Can you pinpoint one example of that made its way into the final film?
Sure, it's a tiny little example, but there's a moment where they drive to Audrey and Dan drive to another hospital's file room to grab
Hmm.
some research. And they pull up in the car and they go down a brick. And we were meant to shoot in a whole other direction. But when I showed up on set, I was told that the people that owned those buildings no longer wanted us to shoot there. And so we lost a full 75% of my original location, and we couldn't go find another location. And it's independent film. You got 23 days. You got to figure it out. So I was able to just sort of say, give me 15 minutes. And I do really detailed shot lists and maps and camera positions and things like that. Again, indie film. So I just was able to configure it this way and ended up being better. The brick is more beautiful. The walk, the two of them walk to the back door. It's just a nice vanishing point. So, I remember reading somewhere that Truffaut said, I think it's Truffaut. I don't quote me on this quote, but that Truffaut said you should always leave a door open on your set because you never know what will walk in. And that's really stuck with me.
I like that. I like that a lot. Um, when it comes to cures for cancer, I mean, we still don't have it. There's been excellent advancements made in treatment. Obviously, this film explores that. How would you like categorize like what Dr. Audrey Evans was able to accomplish here within I guess you would call it like the timeline of progress, if you will, to getting closer to a cure for cancer?
Oh, it's kind of mind-boggling what she was able to do. At the time that she started, um, pediatric cancer was basically, particularly neuroblastoma, was basically, like it was expected that 80% of the patients would die. So essentially it was hospice care. The mandate was, and we had the great good fortune of being able to meet a lot of doctors or nurses who either worked with Audrey or worked in that time period. You were managing their pain. And trying to facilitate an easy passing. And through many of her advances, including Evans staging system for neuroblastoma specifically, and also her use of combination chemotherapy. Now that statistic is it's expected that 80% of kids will live.
Hmm.
And that's just really due to her work. And then there were all sorts of tangential advances that they made. Like Dan was designing metal plates to be because in the film a child is given radiation and it's accurate to the time. It was just radiation over the whole body, hoping it would affect the cancer. He was designing plates to position over the child to protect organs from the radiation, knowing that it would, there was no anti-nausea medication, so it was also just sort of trying to manage if the kids were being given combination chemotherapy, how to manage the side effects of nausea. And then also just the idea of whole child care, like bringing the family, making sure that the child's not alone. Again, harkening back, I think, to her own experiences, having been a child who was ill. So at the time, the families would literally just sleeping bags on the floor next to the kid's bed, and just really kind of incorporating the family unit into the healing as well. That was all
Yeah.
her.
Hearing you talk about this, I'm always amazed on any film how much a director has to immerse themselves, obviously within the subject of the story that they're telling. That it almost feels like you could get your own PhD from the amount of research that you do on this topic.
I don't know about that, but I was just scratching the surface. Hopefully enough that, doctors and nurses, that was my mandate. I don't want there to be a single doctor or nurse that watches this movie and thinks this is not actually how you hold a syringe. I wanted at least to pay that respect.
That's totally fair and understandable. For those that don't know, because I think this is the first time we've had you on our show before, you are the daughter, of course, of Michael Mann, prolific, iconic film director. When he watches your films, does he give feedback? Does he just give encouragement? What does he say?
He doesn't watch them until they're finished.
Uh-huh.
So, and then he says, "Good job."
Yeah.
And then we go get dinner.
I love it.
We just, yeah.
That's fantastic. And of course, now, like I was saying before, this has been a long road here, 23 days of shooting, like you said, but we're talking what, 5, 6 years from the time of development till now?
Yeah, well, Julia Fisher-Farman, who's the producer and screenwriter, she's been working on this movie for a long time. She knew, as I said, she knew Audrey as a child and had an idea to make this into a film some years ago. So she'd been developing the script for a long time.
Jeez,
I was like, I'm going to say maybe 7 years.
it's a long
Then,
time.
and she raised, this is a independent film, soup to nuts. She raised every penny on her own and
Wow.
the way through to distribution. And then I was brought on in 22. I got the script through my representation, and then we wrapped in 22, and then we finished in 23 with the mix and the cut and everything.
Wow.
So
And now here
yeah,
we are in 2025, and the film
yeah.
is just seeing release at this point. In that amount of time, have you had a chance to start development on what would be considered the next project?
I have. Yeah, I actually wrote two screenplays, and I write fiction I write fiction on the side. I publish
Oh,
short stories under
no
a
big
name.
deal. Just,
un- Well, I don't publish books yet, but I publish short stories with the name Ray Canaan under a different name. So I wrote a novel. So, but I just always like to be writing. But yeah. So the next thing I'd like to do is I wrote a sci-fi and I wrote a gothic horror period piece. So we'll see
wow.
what happens. Yeah.
That's really, really intriguing. I imagine that would not be able to play within the independent realm, or
I think
would it
so.
have to?
Always. I think I'm independent through and through. I think it's just in my nature and my bones. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you
Yeah.
certainly sound like you have a really firm grasp of it and know how to turn it to your advantage. So I want to
Oh,
thank you here for the time, Amy. Thank you, and best of luck to you. Wishing you, nothing but the best as this film, like I said, Audrey's Children's being released in theaters on March 28th.
thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Take care.